So this evening, I'm going to talk about myths and nature of governance in Singapore, but I'm going to have to beg your indulgence a little, because I'm going to start 2,500 years ago with Republican Rome. Now, Republican Rome despised kings. When they overthrew the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, in 509 BC, they said, no more kings, right? And as a republic, the Republic of Rome would go on to dominate the Mediterranean. It would go on to become the most powerful state, the most powerful empire in the world to that point, last over 1,000 years. But once all its rivals were defeated, once it had conquered all the known world, then where would it go on to? That's when all its leading citizens turned on each other, right? And decades of civil war followed. And so finally, in 27 BC, Octavius defeated all his rivals and became the sole unchallenged power in Rome. And a Senate exhausted by war, exhausted by strife, granted him extraordinary powers. They granted him the power of life over death. They granted him the ability to suspend individual liberties, to take away the restraints holding back state power. He took away the laws safeguarding individuals from state oppression. And he became the divine Augustus, the first and greatest emperor of the Romans. But here's the problem, right? Who determines, in this new environment, who determines the needs of the state? Who determines when and how to use these new state powers? It's the Emperor Augustus. But if Republican Rome, if Imperial Rome despises kings, if you cannot be a king, how do you justify holding on to these extensive powers? How do you justify holding absolute power over life, over death, if you're not a king? And that's where Augustus formulated the princeps model, principle. He was the first citizen. He was the first citizen because he was the best, he was the smartest, he was the most powerful of the Romans. And therefore, because of this, he was best placed to decide what was best for the Roman people and what was best placed for the Roman Republic. It's important to note he never actually abolished the Republic, but instead he cloaked his autocracy in a veneer of republicanism. He held elected officers, and he continued to run the Republican Constitution. And he passed legislation as needed to give himself the necessary legislative justification for his actions. So in summary, why does the princeps rule the Republic? Why does the first citizen rule the Republic? Because without him, the Republic is vulnerable. Without his legitimized tyranny, there would be chaos, there would be civil war. The Republic is vulnerable to chaos, and the princeps protects it. Also, because of development, the princeps is the smartest and best. He's a capable ruler who knows how best to develop Rome for the benefit of her citizens. And because the Republic is a meritocracy, because the princeps has risen to the top through all this internal competition, he's smarter than you, he's better than you, he knows what to do. Vulnerability, development, and meritocracy. All these things in your head, we'll come back to them. So let's step forward now 2,000 years to another empire, the British Empire. When the British decided to decolonize Singapore, they needed to ensure that their interests would be protected after they left. And the best way to do this was to actually turn Singaporeans into loyal British subjects. People who identified their interests as British interests, who identified their future with Britain's future, who wanted leaders who would govern in favor of Britain. So the British embarked on social engineering that was unparalleled in the British Empire. And this was accompanied, in order to enforce these new laws, this social engineering, with unprecedented violence. They subordinated individual rights to the needs of the state, they crippled institutional restraints on state power, and they suspended laws safeguarding individual liberty against state oppression. But how do you justify doing this? Especially when you are a colonial power on the verge of decolonizing. The British relied chiefly on three arguments: vulnerability, development, and meritocracy. Let's take each of them in turn. First, they declared that Singapore was constantly vulnerable to subversion. It was constantly teetering on the edge of disaster. The Malayan emergency provided the initial justification. Of course, Tony Stockwell, in his work, has noted that the British, when they declared the emergency, never actually had the evidence that the MCP was at fault, was to blame for the outbreaks of violence. They took a leap of faith and assumed it and then justified it through evidence found later. In Singapore, special branch documents, especially newly declassified ones, show that the MCP actually never had much of a grip on Singapore. By 1948, with the outbreak of the emergency, most of them, finding Singapore a less fertile ground to till, had moved north across the causeway. So they never had a significant foothold, they never had significant control of their supporters, who embarked on uncontrolled, unprovoked violence, in contrary to many MCP orders. If you talk to Warren Hui, who was the head of the MCP at the time, who's still alive, you can go speak to him, I think he lives in Katong, he will tell you that they never actually had control for most of the emergency, that all these people committing atrocities in the MCP name, many of them were doing it in defiance of the orders. There was no order, there was no plan. All right? The Anti-British League only existed on paper. It was a propaganda tool used by both sides to really try and boost the activities of what Special Branch and what the MCP were doing. So hounded by Special Branch, the MCP lurched from crisis to crisis in Singapore. They never had any coherent foothold, and they were pretty much crushed in 1950 when the entire town committee was arrested. After that, violence began to tail off in Singapore. And as evidence of subversion, of communist conspiracy became more difficult to come by, the definition of communist conspiracy, of communism, had to correspondingly expand in order for Special Branch to continue to justify their level of activity. And so as less and less violence ensued, more and more the definition of communism likewise expanded, to the point where in 1957, Special Branch Director Alan Blades and Colonial Secretary William Good, who later became governor and our first Yang di-Pertuan Negara, wrote a memoranda. They wrote several memoranda basically justifying communism, defining communism as anything that opposes the government. The logic is that, anything which opposes the government, which provides resistance to government authority, encourages the spirit of revolt. It encourages defiance to the government. And by encouraging defiance to the government, you weaken government authority, you weaken the state of Singapore, and therefore you are a communist. And so based on these memoranda, Lim Mee Hok's government would go on to arrest over 300 people, activists, dissidents, politicians, trade unionists, from September to November 1956. Now the second argument is the logic of development. And in British memoranda, a self-congratulatory narrative develops throughout its period, throughout the colonial period. The British developed Singapore. They brought prosperity and peace and stability. And they transformed the former insignificant fishing village into, by 1950, a vibrant global metropolis. That's the impression you get if you read the memoranda. And to a very great extent, this is true. By 1950, Singapore was the richest country in Asia. The only place in Asia richer than Singapore was metropolitan Tokyo. It was famous then for everything that we are famous for today. Tall buildings, wide boulevards, clean drinking water. We had more cars per capita than anywhere in Asia. We were famous for being a great trading port, a offshore financial center, a specialized commodities future market, distribution center, world market for rubber and tin, major world oil distribution center. Singapore was rich. Singapore was prosperous. This rich metropolis had a per capita income of $1,200 million a month, a massive, massive sum, higher than any other country, as I mentioned, in Asia, except for metropolitan Tokyo. And the British officials felt that Singapore's people should be grateful, right? Singapore's so rich, you should be grateful. So Governor Black complains about the ingratitude of municipal voters towards the city council. And he says that they work so hard and the voters want to throw them all out. Never mind that for most Singaporeans, the city council was notoriously corrupt and inefficient. The Director of Education, David McLellan, in a private letter to the governors, complains that everyone keeps complaining about how poor and how inefficient my Department of Education officials are. But they work so hard, everyone's so ungrateful. Never mind that the policy that he was in charge of implementing was to destroy Chinese education, shut down Chinese schools, and block Nanta at by any means necessary. So they had this belief that British rule was good for Malaya and Malaya's future depended on the people accepting British plans for decolonization. And in this narrative, the anti-colonial movement, the left-wing movement, threatens to wreck British plans and jeopardize Malaya's future. This, of course, is a fiction. Malaya was, the goal of the colonial project was capital accumulation, and Malaya was developed with that in mind, right? But the fact is that this is what the British believed, and this is what you see in things like the Manchester Guardian, for example, right? All the way back in the UK, which is writing things in this period like, Malaya's future is inextricably bound up with what Britain can give her. So the third thing, meritocracy. And the British here, you have to remember, they had neither indigeneity nor electoral legitimacy. They were a colonial power. How do they justify their rule? Their authorities grew from treaties signed at the point of a gun. So instead, what they do is they assert a moral and intellectual superiority over the people of Singapore. They say, we are smarter, we are better, we know what Singapore needs to become a peaceful, prosperous, independent state. And so the suspension of the normal rules of law and governance are presented as beneficial to Singapore because it allows this benevolent, this enlightened British policy to be implemented unhindered. Now, to promote these stories, these myths, the British relied on instruments of control, specifically intellectual control and legislative control, right, beyond the normal state monopoly of violence. So they need us to believe these myths, so they exercised intellectual control over what we thought. The British presented themselves as both the source and the arbiter of the nation's values, and thus sole arbiter of what constituted subversion. Any alternative conception of Malayan identity had to be suppressed, whether it was, no matter what its inherent value was, because if the British accept that there is another legitimate political discourse, then they have to accept that they do not have a monopoly on what is right and wrong. And that is why Chinese education had to be crushed, because, of course, in Singapore, 75% Chinese, of which 90% spoke Chinese as a first language. Chinese was the dominant language of political discourse in all its various dialects. Right? And that's why Chinese is portrayed in colonial documents as inherently subversive, as inherently backwards, as inherently weak. So only by limiting legitimate public discourse to English could the British then monopolize public discourse and monopolize definitions. Only they could say what is or isn't subversive. Only they could interpret what was responsible or moderate or constructive politics. So colonial documents thus paint a comprehensive story of subversion in a coded language which Ranajit Guha very memorably called the prose of counterinsurgency. And in these documents, Singapore's people are stripped of agency by colonial control and actually are depicted in these colonial documents as inherently lacking any agency, any ability to think for themselves or act for themselves. And secondly, of course, regulatory control enabled the suppression of opposing narratives and of anti-colonial movements. So the British passed legislation which enabled things like the policing of the media, censorship, intervention into schools, detention without trial, breaking up legitimate strikes, denying workers' rights, seizing land and evicting occupants, and the dissolution of anti-colonial associations. And this facilitated the process of cultural and societal transformation that the British sought to impose. And so they, using a compliant legislature, right? They could pass these laws at will. Now, how do you ensure a compliant legislature? Well, they influence the outcome of elections by limiting the franchise where possible. You know, until 55, the franchise was severely limited. Until 59, if you were foreign-born, the barrier to becoming a citizen was incredibly high, especially if you were born in China, of course. And of course, things like the infamous Subversives Clause in 1957, which banned anyone detained, not convicted, just detained for subversion from standing. So by passing this illiberal legislation through the form, but not the substance, of British parliamentary democracy, colonial administrators could then say, look, we have the rule of law, right? We are doing everything in accordance with the law. Never mind that the law is whatever we get to say it is, we're still doing things, we have the rule of law. And so for that reason, actually in 1962, when the PAP said we have to hold a referendum on merger, the British tried to dissuade them. They said, you can just pass this through the legislature and we can then sell this to the rest of the world as having been passed through a proper legal legislative system. Why do you need to go to the people and have a referendum, which you might actually lose? But of course, for political reasons, if the PAP didn't hold a referendum, they would be very vulnerable to their own claim of being representative of the people. But you can see from how the British look at it, right? The will of the people doesn't matter. It's the form of the process that matters. So let's take a step forward and go to another republic and its first ruler. Now, if you're the first ruler of Singapore, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, you've just been handed power by the British. Where does your power come from? Where does your legitimacy come from? You're not an indigenous people. You've won an election under very dubious circumstances where you've put your political opponents into cold storage. So what do? You take a leaf out of the previous colonial government. You reject democracy, you suspend individual rights, you continue to cripple all sorts of safeguards against your exercise of state power, etc., by arguing that Singapore is an exceptional case. You argue for Singaporean exceptionalism. Why? You use the three myths of vulnerability, development, and meritocracy. So you say that Singapore is extremely vulnerable, right? And you focus on two events that define this, are central to this myth of vulnerability. The first is the Japanese occupation, right, which governments routinely cite as a massive shock and evidence of Singapore's vulnerability. But if you stop to think about it, why did Winston Churchill call Singapore, the fall of Singapore, the worst British military disaster since Yorktown? If Singapore was so vulnerable, why was the fall of Singapore such a shock? The fact is Singapore was the least vulnerable place in Southeast Asia, and that's why its fall was such a shock. It was the impregnable and fortified linchpin of British military force in Southeast Asia, and it took the massive Japanese war machine, which conquered all of Southeast Asia, to take out Singapore. So of course, the second is, of course, the Malayan emergency and communism. But as we've already discussed, that is largely also manufactured. And so furthermore, throughout this period, after the emergency and throughout independence, Singapore's security continues to be underwritten by Britain and Australia and the United States. You have confrontation, which in the mid-60s was costing Britain $1 million a day to fight an undeclared war against Indonesia. You have the Vietnam War, which the US military built up massive presence here. And of course, the Americans are still here. And we also have the SAF, which military analysts routinely call the most powerful military force in Southeast Asia. So the point I'm making is not that Singapore is invulnerable, but that if you look at the facts, Singapore, I think we can say at best, is no more or less vulnerable than anywhere else in Southeast Asia. And so to argue for an exceptional case of vulnerability is overblown. Then there's the logic of development, which says that before independence, Singapore was a poor country, and then the PAP made Singapore a rich country, right? Aided, of course, by the suspension of democracy and liberty. We know for a fact that by 1950, Singapore was already a fabulously rich country. Lee Kuan Yew himself in 1960, as his electoral fortunes declined, as he got more and more unpopular, kept going around saying, look, Singapore has the highest income in Asia. If you read the Straits Times 1960, he kept saying this to try and point out how good we were doing, right? And of course, Singapore did have the highest per capita income in Asia. In actual fact, the PAP's great achievement was not to make Singapore rich. Before independence, Singapore was rich, but it was also a very unequal and unfair place. It was very discriminatory towards its citizens. And so the PAP's great achievement was to make Singapore fair. It was to make Singapore a fair and equitable place where if you worked hard, you would gain a salary, you would gain returns, rewards commensurate with your effort. Because the product of Singapore's wealth, of course, came from colonial exploitation of Singapore's people. Right? Singaporean wages were held artificially low. Singapore's mean income in 1957, as I mentioned, was $1,200 million a month. But the modal, that's the most common wage of male workers in regular employment, was about $100 million a month. And that is the same as the modal and the median wage were both $100 a month, and that was the same as the poverty line, $100 a month. So Singapore's rich were so incredibly rich that they pulled up the mean, the average per capita income to 12 times the modal and median wage. Singaporeans had no labor rights, no protections, no women's rights. The cost of living was really high, extremely high housing costs, massive housing shortage, extremely high healthcare costs, extremely high transport costs. The non-English educated Singaporeans were systematically discriminated against because access to education, to government bureaucracy, public services, public sector jobs were all limited to the English speaking. And so the Labour Front and the PAP government, right, the Labour Front from 55 to 59 and PAP government onwards, worked to break this systemic discrimination. They were proudly socialist and implemented these progressive policies which protected workers and expanded educational opportunities and protected the equality of language. The PAP laid extensive plans for social welfare, as Tjin is going to tell you about, and they also supported Nanta and the Chinese language and the Malay language in the Tamil education system. They understood that people work best when they are paid a fair wage and they are empowered and free from worrying about things like healthcare and education and housing. So the PAP's legacy is not as popularly assumed from the myths that we are told of enriching Singapore. It's of making Singapore a fair and equitable place. It's of creating a system of social justice and opportunity, protecting and preserving citizens' rights, and allowing citizens to share in the gains of economic growth. And of course, the third myth is meritocracy. And again, this myth needs to be understood in historical context. Now, the PAP, of course, itself was funded as a broad coalition of anti-colonial left-wing forces from a wide variety of backgrounds. You have, for example, in 1959, its candidates included academics and doctors, and civil servants and lawyers and accountants, and trade unionists and farmers, and barbers and carpenters and seamstress. So the PAP's first generation, the old guard that we celebrate so much, is an example of how great leadership talents can be found from people of all backgrounds, regardless of education, regardless of upbringing. But after the party split several times in the 50s and in the early 60s, the leadership needed people they could trust to fill the ranks, and so they turned to people they definitely could trust, people who were just like them. So these are friends, these are colleagues, these are relatives, people with talent, people who were very smart, but people who thought very much like the leaders of the PAP. And so power became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a very narrow elite. And over time, this has meant increasing homogeneity of thought, of values, of experience. They think alike, they feel alike, they believe the same things. And so multiple studies of Singapore's elite, including by Chris Changwan over there, and most recently by Michael Barr, have showed that there are actually several predominant characteristics which characterize the vast majority of Singapore's elite. The strongest determinant, Barr found, the strongest determinant of elite status in Singapore is proximity to the inner circle of PAP leadership. The elite are overwhelmingly male, they're overwhelmingly ethnic Chinese, they're overwhelmingly upper class, they've attended a narrow range of schools. I think something more than 90% of scholarship holders come from just 4 schools. I think 2/3 from just 2 schools, right? And of course, because they're overwhelmingly male, they have, most of them have actively served in the military as scholar officers. And entry into this elite, right, is largely an accident of birth. Within this elite, don't get me wrong, within this elite, competition is very fierce and is meritocratic. But Singapore, according to Barr, is now only meritocratic within this narrow elite. So to get in there, to get in there is largely an accident of birth, the rest of Singapore is excluded by definition from the very beginning. And so this leads to the worst of all possible worlds, because you have a pre-selected elite who don't realize they're a pre-selected elite, who, because of the intense competition within the elite, believe that they have gotten to where they are through sheer hard work and therefore owe nothing to the rest of society for their position. And so likewise, to maintain these myths, vulnerability, development, and meritocracy, the PAP, like the British, have used instruments of intellectual and legislative control. In particular, right, as it declined in popularity through the early 60s, the leadership faced this central conundrum of, do we accept the will of the people and lose the next election, or do we suppress it to consolidate our grip on power? And they chose the latter. So they have abandoned attempts to restore democratic normality, and instead they have reasserted Singapore's exceptionalism. Singapore's vulnerability was emphasized. Legislative dominance was used to legitimize regulatory oppression. The media was suppressed, and a monopoly was asserted over public discourse. All opposition has been depicted as subversive, and detention without trial has been used to remove the leadership of the political opposition. So if you look over the decades, the British have actually gone, the PAP has gone further than the British ever were able to or ever dared to. It is the PAP which succeeded in implementing the colonial policies of destroying Chinese education, shutting down Nanta, ending all Chinese schools. Right? It is the PAP which has created a new national narrative which actually celebrates the illiberality of colonial rule by emphasizing the role of PAP in Singapore's development and asserting the superiority of the PAP's leadership. And state resources have been diverted towards the creating and demonstrating of the superiority of the elite, thus creating a self-fulfilling cycle. And further on, if you look at the 1966 Vandalism Act, there's a really good book out by Jyoti Raja. I think probably many of you have seen it. She talks about 1966 Vandalism Act, the 1974 Newspaper and Printing Presses Act, the 1986 Legal Professions Amendment Act, the 1991 Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, all as examples of removing the basic freedoms of the people. And so control of the legislative process and emphasis on the rule of law is central to these pieces of legislation. Right? They continue by emphasizing rule of law. Right? It enables the PAP to emphasize that they continue to observe the form of proper legislative procedure. So opposition leaders are removed through legal processes, legal obstacles are thrown up in front of opposition parties, and legislations and detentions are timed to coincide with elections. And independent civil society, as many people here know, which they only contribute to public discourse on the government's terms. Housing and education policy has been used to further cement control of citizens in the public discourse. And for me, the really sad thing is, Singaporean democracy worked. Between 1955 and 1963, Singaporeans went to the polls an average of once a year. And out of this short period emerged the policies which made Singapore world famous today. The HDB, the CPF, industrialization, a trilingual education system which produced a reasonably talented second generation of PAP leadership. You know, all these great things. And then after the PAP had absolute control in 1968, what do we have? We have Stop at 2, the second industrial revolution, which leads to a 10% drop in GDP in just 1 year. We have the CPF being constantly fiddled with to the point where Hui Hui over there is organizing a protest every week against it. The HDB constantly drawing complaints. And that is the product of a lack of democracy, a lack of debate, a lack of dissent, a lack of new ideas in the government. And so the fact is Singaporean democracy actually worked. It produced a much fairer and equitable country, and it provided the basis for our current modern-day success. So, to conclude then, what does this tell us about the nature of governance in Singapore? I've talked about 3 myths. of vulnerability and development in meritocracy. Well, Lee Kuan Yew years ago, he talked about how these were Asian values, right? The suspension of individual liberty over the needs of the state, Asian values, and he pointed to China. And actually, I think he got it half right. But what he forgot is that China was an empire long before it was Chinese. And that's what it shares in common with the Roman Empire and the British Empire. So what we have today, the nature of our governance in Singapore today, is an imperial government. It is a continuation of the colonial government. Thanks very much.